The hush began at the periphery, a subtle dampening of sound that pressed against my eardrums even before I stepped onto the cold tile of the empty airport concourse with motionless escalators. The air, usually thick with the metallic tang of jet fuel and the distant murmur of 1,000 lives in transit, was instead thin and tasteless like breathing through a veil. My footsteps, usually swallowed by the ambient roar, echoed with an unnerving clarity, a lonely percussive beat against the vast, silent space. The motionless escalators, their ridged steps frozen mid-climb, resembled fossilized waves, leading nowhere. I paused, my duffel bag slung heavy on my shoulder, and looked back at the gateway I had just passed through, expecting to see a flight attendant, a baggage handler, anyone. There was only the vast, sterile quiet, the fluorescent lights humming a low, almost imperceptible note that felt more like a vibration in my bones than a sound. Oakhaven! The name itself tasted like dust and old secrets. My grandmother's cryptic passing had drawn me back, a reluctant moth to a flickering, uncertain flame. The last time I had seen this airport, it had buzzed with the nervous energy of departures and the joyful chaos of arrivals. Now, it was a tomb of forgotten journeys. A small, dark sedan, older than I was, waited curbside. Its engine purred with an almost aggressive gentleness. The driver, a man whose face was a patchwork of deep-set lines and pallid skin, offered no greeting, only a curt nod when I gave my destination. His eyes, the color of river stones, held a peculiar blankness that unsettled me. He didn't ask about my flight, or my grandmother, or the weather. He simply drove, his hands gripping the steering wheel as if it were the only tether to reality. The landscape unfurled outside the window, familiar yet subtly wrong. The trees seemed to lean in closer, their branches interwoven into a denser, more watchful canopy than I remembered. The road narrowed, the asphalt crumbling at the edges, hinting at neglect. I tried to conjure memories of previous drives, of childhood laughter, and my grandmother's stories, but they felt distant, like echoes from another life. It was as if the journey itself was slowly erasing the world I knew, preparing me for something else entirely. We crested a final rise, and Oakhaven lay spread beneath us, nestled in its valley. But even from here I sensed it, the stillness, not the peaceful quiet of a sleeping town, but an unnatural, almost held breath. The sedan rolled through the main street. The storefronts, once vibrant with hand-painted signs and potted flowers, now seemed faded, their windows reflecting nothing but the gray sky. There were few people about. A woman sweeping the stoop of the general store moved with a languid, almost dreamlike slowness, her broom barely disturbing the dust. A man sat on a bench outside the old library, staring straight ahead, his gaze fixed on nothing discernible. No children played in the square, no dogs barked. The air itself felt thick, muffling sound, absorbing joy. This was not the Oakhaven I remembered, the town of boisterous harvest festivals and gossip exchanged over picket fences. This was a place cloaked in a profound, unsettling quiet. The driver pulled up to my grandmother's house. It stood on a slight hill, a Victorian relic with a wrap-around porch and a widow's walk. The paint was peeling, the garden overgrown, but it still held a certain stately dignity. As I stepped out, the gravel crunching under my boots sounded shockingly loud. The driver merely watched me, his expression unchanged, until I shut the door. The porch swing, once a familiar source of creaks and groans, hung motionless. The rose bushes, usually a riot of color, were now skeletal, their thorns sharp and black against the fading light. A faint, almost imperceptible scent hung in the air, something like dry earth and forgotten things, but with an underlying sweetness that was vaguely cloying. I fumbled with the key my grandmother's lawyer had sent. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that pierced the drawn curtains. The furniture was draped in white sheets, ghostly forms in the gloom. It was a tableau of suspended life, a waiting. My grandmother's death had been ruled natural causes by the local constable, but the brief, clipped phone call from the lawyer had hinted at something more. A sudden departure, he'd said, his voice tight. Very sudden. And then, the strange addendum. He left instructions for you, Cole. Specific ones. As I walked through the silent rooms, my hand trailing along a dust-laden banister, I felt it again. The profound, watchful quiet. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was an active presence, a collective hush that seemed to seep from the very walls, from the very earth of Oakhaven. It felt as though the town itself were holding its breath, observing me with 1,000 unseen eyes. The hair on my arms prickled. There was nothing. Only the still air, the muffled world outside, and the growing certainty that my grandmother's death was not the only mystery waiting for me in Oakhaven. I was no longer merely arriving. I was being observed. The profound, watchful quiet clung to me, a shroud woven from the very air of Oakhaven. It followed me from the dust-laden banister, through the creaking parlor door, and out into the muted afternoon light that painted the small, moss-kissed chapel. The sky hung low, a bruised purple-gray, mirroring the ache in my chest that wasn't entirely grief. No, this was something sharper, a sliver of ice in the marrow. Only a handful of cars dotted the gravel lot. Their paint faded, their chrome dull. The gathering inside was sparse, a scattering of familiar faces made unfamiliar by the passage of time and an unsettling stillness in their eyes. The funeral director, a gaunt man with hands like gnarled roots, moved with a practiced, almost mechanical grace. He offered me a nod that lacked warmth, a gesture hollowed out by routine. I sat in the front pew, the polished wood cold beneath my palm. I remembered her laugh, a bright, brittle sound, and the way her hands, papery with age, would clench when he was cross. But even these recollections felt distant, filtered through a fog. After the brief, hushed service, a procession of muted condolences began. I sought out the faces I knew, hungry for a connection, for a shared memory to anchor me. Cole, a distant cousin, a woman with hair like spun silver and eyes that seemed perpetually startled, offered a faint smile. It's been years, too long, I agreed, trying to infuse my voice with genuine warmth. How have you been? And do you remember when grandmother used to bake those impossible fruit tarts? The ones with the candy ginger? Her smile faltered, replaced by a slight furrow of her brow. Fruit tarts? She mused, her gaze drifting past my shoulder, unfocused. I don't recall him baking much. Cole, he was more of a gardener, wasn't she? Always with her hands in the soil. My own memory jolted. Gardening, yes, she loved her roses, but the fruit tarts were a vivid, undeniable taste from my childhood. I could almost feel the sticky glaze on my fingers. No, she definitely baked, I insisted gently, a tremor of unease starting to ripple beneath my composure. Especially for my birthdays. She'd always make one for me, even after I moved away. The cousin blinked, then offered a shrug that seemed too casual, too dismissive. Perhaps my memory isn't what it used to be. It's been a long time, after all. The response was unsettling, a small discordant note in the quiet symphony of the funeral. I moved on, seeking out a man who had once been my father's closest friend, his face now etched with more lines than I remembered. Cole, my boy, the friend said, his voice raspy. Sorry for your loss. Thank you, I replied, feeling the familiar weight of the words. It's good to see you. Do you remember the old fishing trips with my father and grandmother? She'd always pack those sandwiches, remember? The ones with the dill pickles. He stared at me, a blankness descending over his features. Fishing trips? He repeated, his eyes, once keen and full of mirth, now held a dull, distant sheen. Your grandmother, she hated the water, didn't she? Grandmother, who had taught me to bait a hook, who would sit patiently on the riverbank, reading a worn paperback as my father and I cast our lines. My memory of her, so vibrant and specific, was being contradicted, not just once, but twice by people who should have known her. She loved watching us, even if she didn't fish herself. She'd always bring a thermos of hot cocoa. The man merely nodded slowly, his gaze drifting away, as if my words were inconsequential, easily forgotten. Well, this wasn't just forgetfulness. It was a shared erasure, a collective revision of the past. Their eyes held a strange, muted quality, a uniform blandness that was deeply unsettling. Their responses, though different in content, shared an identical, vacant detachment. Later, as the last of the mourners dispersed, leaving me alone with the spectral presence of the funeral director, I felt an inexplicable pull towards the outskirts of town. My feet, as if guided by some subterranean current, led me through overgrown fields, past skeletal trees, until I reached a place I knew, yet didn't. Before me loomed a vast, derelict structure, its metal frame corroded, its windows shattered like frozen tears. The motionless escalators, their teeth frozen in an eternal ascent, stretched into the gloom, a silent promise of journeys never taken. I walked the vast, echoing space, my footsteps loud in the profound quiet. The air was stale, tasting of rust and forgotten dreams. Why was this here? I had no recollection of Oakhaven ever having an airport, not even a regional one. Yet, the architectural details, the sprawling scale, the empty gates where planes should have docked, were undeniable. Had I simply forgotten this monumental landmark? Or was this another fracture, a piece of the town's memory, or my own, that had been quietly excised? The longer I stood amidst the hushed desolation, the more the unsettling uniformity of the townsfolk's responses echoed in my mind. The fruit tarts, the fishing trips, my grandmother's aversion to water, all dismissed with a casual, almost practiced ease. It wasn't just my grandmother they seemed to forget, but the details of their own lives, the textures of shared experiences. A dizzying wave washed over me, a sudden, terrifying thought that perhaps my memories were the fractured ones. Perhaps I was the one inventing histories, imposing them onto a reality that never existed. I pressed my palms against my my temples, the cold metal of the concourse walls an unyielding reality against my questioning mind. Oakhaven was not just quiet. It was emptying itself, one memory at a time, and I wondered, with a sickening lurch, how much of me would be left by the time I understood why. The muted quality in their gazes, a bland uniformity, had clung to me like a shroud woven from forgotten threads. It was more than simple amnesia. It was a curated void, a deliberate erosion of shared history. The collective responses, disparate in their superficial content, echoed a deeper, more unsettling chorus, a quiet, almost imperceptible agreement to forget. My grandmother, I knew, had resisted such an easy surrender. Her final, fractured words had been a desperate plea, a broken mirror reflecting a truth too terrible for the town to hold. The journey to her house, a weathered sentinel on the edge of Oakhaven, felt like a descent into an older, heavier quiet. The air itself seemed to thicken with the scent of damp earth and time-worn wood. I pushed open the front door, and the groan of hinges was a lament. The house breathed around me, a silent, hollow echo of a life lived intensely, then suddenly extinguished. A teacup still sat on a coaster by her reading chair, a faint ring marking its presence. I moved through the rooms with a strange reverence, a sense of intrusion mixed with an urgent need to understand. I began the somber task of sifting through her belongings, each object a small, tangible anchor in a sea of encroaching oblivion. Letters, tied with brittle ribbons, spoke of distant relatives I barely remembered. My hands, restless and seeking, gravitated towards her study, a room steeped in a scent of old paper and dried ink. Shelves groaned under the weight of books, their spines cracked and faded. I ran my fingers along their worn surfaces, a silent communion with her intellectual spirit. It was then, as I knelt before a lower shelf crammed with obscure local histories and botanical guides, that my eye caught a faint discrepancy. A section of the wainscoting, just above the skirting board, seemed to sit a fraction too proud. My fingers explored the seam, finding a subtle give. With a quiet click, a small panel swung inward, revealing a narrow, dust-lined cavity. My breath hitched. Inside, nestled amongst cobwebs, lay a single, leather-bound journal. It was old, its cover scuffed and scarred, the leather softened by countless hours of handling. The clasp, a tarnished brass buckle, was undone, as if he had left it open for me to find. I pulled it free, the weight of it surprisingly substantial. The paper felt thick and fibrous beneath my thumb, yellowed with age. The first few pages held neat, measured entries, chronicling daily life in Oakhaven years ago. Garden observations, community events, mundane appointments. But as I turned the pages, the script began to change. The elegant loops grew hurried, then frantic, a rustling where there should be none, a voice that isn't truly sound. My gaze darted across the page, my heart quickening. Another entry, weeks later by the fading dates, read, "The forgetting takes root. Small things at first. Names, dates, then faces. Now places. The old mill gone from their minds. The weeping willow, a phantom." My eyes snagged on a series of strange symbols, crudely drawn yet disturbingly precise. They were not hieroglyphs, nor any script I recognized. They looked like tangled roots, or perhaps veins, spreading across the page, sometimes forming unsettlingly familiar patterns, like a distorted map of the human brain, or a fractured star chart. My grandmother hadn't merely been losing her memory. He had been documenting a plague of the mind. Further entries spoke of Oakhaven's true foundation, hinting at something ancient and hungry beneath the town's placid surface. She wrote of the family's solemn duty, a legacy she believed had been betrayed, allowing the entity to stir. The words were fragmented, desperate, each one a shard of a greater, horrifying mosaic. It feeds on what makes us us. One passage ended, the ink smeared as if by a tear, the collective weave of memory. To forget is to become part of it. My mind reeled, trying to reconcile her wild warnings with the placid, forgetting faces of the townsfolk. The journal was a testament to her struggle, a beacon of sanity in a town succumbing to a strange, shared delusion. I felt a sudden, visceral jolt of recognition as I turned another page. A crude, but unmistakable sketch dominated the center, a vast, desolate structure, all concrete and glass, with long, empty corridors stretching into the distance. Below it, a scrawled caption read, "The threshold, where journeys end before they truly begin. An abandoned development, a grand, failed vision from decades past." It had always seemed a monument to futility. But now, in the context of my grandmother's frantic writings, it took on a terrifying new significance. A threshold, a forgotten gate. The journal was not just a record of her descent, but a roadmap, a warning. And I was now holding the first terrifying clue. The journal, A brittle landscape of forgotten ink lay splayed across my grandmother's kitchen table. Its unsettling truths, half-formed and spectral, pulsed in the quiet air, weaving themselves into the very fabric of Oakhaven. I remembered the chilling silence of it even then, a silence that felt less like absence and more like a held breath. The revelations had opened a fissure in the mundane. A low, insistent hum began to thread through the stillness, a sound not quite audible, but felt like a pressure behind my ears. Fleeting, formless eddies of sound, just beyond the threshold of understanding. I would pause, straining to discern a word, a phrase, but they would dissipate like smoke, leaving only the echo of their presence. They seemed to coil from the corners of rooms, from the rustling leaves outside the window, from the very air I breathed, suggesting a collective voice, a chorus of forgotten things. My gaze, once steady, began to betray me. A sudden shift in the light from the window, a fleeting impression of movement in the hallway, gone the instant I turned my head. Oakhaven, once merely strange, now felt actively hostile, a living thing exhaling a silent threat. I needed air, needed to move. I stepped out into the town. The afternoon sun a pale, watery wash over the familiar storefronts, but even the sunlight felt thin, diluted, as if some vital essence had been leached from it. The first hint of absence arrived subtly. The baker's shop, usually redolent with the scent of warm yeast and cinnamon, stood eerily quiet. Its windows, typically steamed with the promise of fresh bread, were clear, almost sterile. The bell above the door, which I had heard chime countless times since my return, remained silent, untouched. I peered inside. The display cases were empty, scrubbed clean. No flour dust on the counter, no faint scent of sugar. It wasn't merely closed, it was vacant, as if it had been shuttered for months, yet I had bought a loaf there only 2 days prior. I walked on, my senses now hyper-alert, searching for other discrepancies. The elderly gardener, a man whose gnarled hands were as much a fixture of the town square as the fountain itself, was nowhere to be seen. His usual bench beneath the weeping willow was empty. A small, forgotten trowel lay on the damp earth beside a half-tended rose bush, its metallic gleam a stark contrast to the verdant surroundings. It looked like it had been dropped in haste, then simply left. I passed a group of townsfolk gathered near the old general store. Their conversation was low, hushed. I caught fragments. Didn't see the postman this week. The mill worker's cottage, empty now, isn't it? No alarm, no frantic search, just a quiet, almost dismissive acknowledgement of these disappearances, as if the concept of someone simply ceasing to be was not an anomaly, but a minor inconvenience, easily filed away in the recesses of a fading collective memory. Their eyes, when they met mine, were blank, unburdened by curiosity or concern. The entity, I realized with a sickening lurch, wasn't just feeding on memories, it was erasing the very people whose memories sustained the town. The pull towards the outskirts, towards the remembered desolation, became undeniable. I drove, the narrow roads winding through skeletal woods until the trees began to thin, giving way to overgrown fields and the skeletal remains of what was once a grand, failed vision. Its windows, once gleaming, were now fractured eyes reflecting only the gray sky. I parked the car, the crunch of gravel beneath my tires echoing unnaturally loud. I walked towards the main entrance, the vast, echoing space drawing me in like a hungry maw. The motionless escalators, frozen in their ascent and descent, stood like petrified waves, leading to nowhere, carrying no one. Their metal teeth, once polished by countless feet, were now caked with dust and a grime of decades. Here, in this monument to collective forgetting, the air thrummed with a terrible, voiceless energy. This place was not merely abandoned, it was waiting. The disappearances were no longer a theory, but a stark reality. It was more than a memory, it was a premonition of absence, of what happens when the very mechanism of remembrance ceases to function. The journal spoke of a place where the river bends and the stone forgets, a cryptic directive that pointed unequivocally to the old mill. The morning light, thin and hesitant, spilled across the page, illuminating a crude sketch, a series of interlocking, non-Euclidean patterns, unsettling in their ancient symmetry. These designs, my grandmother's frantic hand had noted, were etched into the very bones of the mill. This was my destination, a rusted landmark on the town's forgotten edge, a place of industry now swallowed by the encroaching wild. I left the house, the door clicking shut behind me with a sound that seemed too loud in the pervasive quiet of Oakhaven. The few houses I passed were silent, their windows like vacant eyes. No children played, no elderly residents sat on porches. The town was a tableau of suspended animation, a breath held too long. The unsettling uniformity of the townsfolk's vacant stares, their oddly synchronized movements, haunted the edges of my vision even when they were absent. I felt their collective, muted gaze, a pressure on my skin, though no one was there to see me. The mill, when it finally loomed into view, was a skeleton against the bruised sky. A pervasive, musty odor, a blend of damp stone, decay, and something acridly metallic, met me, clinging to the air like a shroud. A massive, splintered wooden door, hanging precariously from a single hinge, offered an invitation to the encroaching gloom. I pushed it inward, and the wood groaned in protest, a long, drawn-out cry that echoed through the cavernous interior. Enormous gears, caked in layers of grime, stood frozen, their teeth bared in a silent snarl. Conveyor belts hung in limp, tattered strips, and the air was thick with the ghost of industry, of human effort now utterly consumed by stillness. I moved with a deliberate slowness, my senses stretched taut. I began my search where the journal hinted, along the oldest sections of the mill, near the river-facing walls. Minutes bled into a quarter hour, then more. The sheer scale of the place, the labyrinthine arrangement of defunct equipment, threatened to overwhelm me. A sudden, sharp creak from the floorboards above sent a jolt through me, though I knew the place was long abandoned. It was the sound of a settling beam, or perhaps something less benign. Then, my beam caught something. I approached, my heart a dull, insistent drum against my ribs. As my light swept closer, the patterns emerged from beneath a century of accumulated grime. They were there, precisely as my grandmother had sketched them. The interlocking spirals, the angular, impossibly sharp curves that seemed to shift and writhe at the edge of my perception. They were alien, yet hauntingly familiar, stirring something primal and unsettling deep within me. I followed the source, my flashlight beam dancing over the carvings. One section of the wall, where the most intricate of the symbols converged, seemed to recede slightly. I pushed, testing it gently. Not there. I pushed harder, applying my weight, and with a low, grinding groan of stone against stone, a section of the wall pivoted inward. Before me lay a passage, a gaping maw of absolute blackness that seemed to drink the light from my beam. The air thrummed with a subtle, almost imperceptible vibration, a low hum that resonated in my bones. This was it, the hidden passage leading deeper, below the river, below the town, into the ancient heart of Oakhaven's secret. My grandmother's final desperate scrawls had pointed the way, not with directions, but with a plea, a warning etched into the very paper. Find the root, sever the tendril. Fear, a cold, sharp thing, pricked at my skin, but beneath it, a current of grim resolve flowed. I had come to Oakhaven for answers, and the passage, a gaping maw hidden beneath the floorboards of the old cannery, promised them. I gathered my meager supplies, a powerful lantern, a coil of rope, and the journal tucked securely into my pack. The first steps were tentative, each footfall echoing back from a darkness that seemed to swallow sound. The passage narrowed quickly, forcing me to stoop, my shoulders brushing against the damp rock. A fine, gritty dust coated everything, clinging to my clothes, filling my nostrils with the scent of decay and mineral. The descent was relentless. The passage twisted, turned, and plunged deeper, a labyrinthine artery into the earth's forgotten core. After what felt like hours, the passage opened into a cavern, vast and echoing. My lantern struggled to pierce its depths, but it revealed a floor littered with scattered stones and, unmistakably, bones. Not animal bones, I realized with a sickening jolt, but human. They lay haphazardly, bleached and brittle, some partially buried in the loose earth, others ranged in crude, unsettling patterns. A femur here, a rib cage there, like discarded offerings to a forgotten god. My light caught the glint of something else. Crude carvings on the cave walls, symbols I didn't understand, geometric patterns interwoven with abstract depictions of grasping hands and faceless figures. I pressed on, my determination warring with a rising tide of nausea. The tunnel ahead pulsed with a faint, sickly green luminescence, a light that seemed to emanate from the very rock. As I rounded a final bend, the light intensified, revealing the source of the terrible odor and the unsettling glow. The tunnel wall had ceased to be stone. Instead, a vast, undulating mass clung to it, a pulsating, organic growth of sickly, pearlescent tissue. It stretched across the cavern, a living, breathing entity, its surface slick and glistening like raw, exposed muscle. It was the sound of a vast, unseen heart, beating deep within the air. Tiny, hair-like tendrils, and possibly delicate yet disturbingly strong, extended from the main mass, weaving themselves into the surrounding rock, disappearing into unseen crevices. Some of these tendrils terminated in small, bulbous sacs, each one faintly glowing with the same sickly green light, like eyes that never blinked. This was it. I knew. This was the entity's manifestation, a feeder node, a physical anchor for the creeping horror that consumed Oakhaven's memories. I stood frozen, the beam of my lantern trembling in my grip. The air around the growth was warm, strangely humid, and the cloying scent intensified, filling my mouth with a metallic sweetness that made me gag. The rhythmic thrumming vibrated through the soles of my boots, through my bones, a deep, resonant hum that seemed to speak directly to the oldest, most primal parts of my mind. It was a sound of immense, terrible power, a sound of consumption and endless hunger. My grandmother's warning echoed, "Sever the tendril." But how does one sever something so vast, so ancient, so utterly alien and alive? The sheer scale of it, the undeniable reality of its presence, threatened to crush my resolve, to render me just another forgotten memory, another silent offering to the vast, hungry consciousness that lurked beneath Oakhaven. The passage beneath the old cannery was less a tunnel and more a wound in the earth, a jagged tear into the town's hidden core. I descended into its maw, the lantern beam a fragile spear against the encroaching black. The air grew heavy with the scent of wet earth and something else, something metallic and cold, like old blood or forgotten machinery. Each step I took on the uneven ground sent a soft scuffing sound echoing ahead, swallowed by the vast, unseen spaces. The initial descent was steep, the walls of compacted soil and exposed roots pressing in, sometimes slick with a pale, phosphorescent slime that offered no light but caught the lantern's glow with an eerie, sickly sheen. My breath plumed in the chill air. The silence was profound, broken only by the rhythmic drip of water somewhere far off and the frantic thrum of my own pulse in my ears. This was not a natural place. My lantern beam stretched further, revealing not rough-hewn rock, but something smoother, more defined. And then, the light caught it, and my breath hitched in my throat. It was impossible. A vast, echoing chamber carved out of the subterranean rock, yet perfectly mimicking an architectural space that had no business existing here. Pristine, polished floor tiles, pale and unmarred, gleamed faintly under my lantern. The escalators, twin rivers of still metal, ascended into an unseen upper level, their steps frozen in an eternal climb. It was as if a moment had been plucked from time and enshrined in this subterranean vault, devoid of life, yet humming with a peculiar, silent energy. This place was a testament to a consciousness far beyond human comprehension. Something that could manifest such a perfect, desolate replica deep within the earth. My footsteps, now painfully loud, echoed across the polished floor as I moved deeper into the concourse. It was then I saw them. They were not gathered in a single cluster, but spread out across the concourse, some standing near the base of the motionless escalators, others seated on invisible benches, their forms vague and indistinct in the low light until my lantern found them. They were the townsfolk, the general store owner, his hands clasped loosely in front of him, the librarian, her spectacles askew on her nose, faces I knew, bodies I recognized, yet utterly alien. Their eyes were open, but vacant, pupils dilated to black pools that reflected nothing, saw nothing. They moved with a slow, almost imperceptible sway, like kelp in a gentle current. It was filled with them, a silent symphony of thought, feeling, and memory, not heard with my ears, but felt in the very marrow of my bones. Fragmented images flickered at the edge of my awareness. A child's laughter on a summer day, the smell of wood smoke in autumn, the warmth of a familiar hand, the sting of a forgotten grief. These were not my memories, yet they resonated within me. Ghost echoes of lives lived, now somehow communal. They were feeding it, the entity, this vast, silent consciousness that had woven itself into the fabric of Oakhaven. Each vacant stare, each slow sway, was an act of surrender, a contribution to the collective. Their individual minds, their unique histories, were being siphoned, blended, dissolved into the whole. They were becoming nodes in a vast, silent network, their identities eroding, their memories becoming shared data points in a greater, unknowable mind. And then, the pull began, subtle at first, like a gentle current in a deep river. Release, let go, joy. It promised an end to the burden of self, to the sharp edges of individual sorrow and fear. It offered the warmth of belonging, the comfort of absolute understanding, the cessation of all struggle. My own memories, my own pains, my own fears, felt suddenly heavy, cumbersome. To simply be with me, the concept was terrifying, yet undeniably alluring. My vision blurred at the edges, the faces of the townsfolk seeming to beckon, their empty eyes holding a perverse invitation. My body felt lighter, my will a fragile thing against the immense, silent gravity of the collective. I clenched my jaw, digging my nails into my palms, the sharp pain a desperate anchor to my own solitary existence. The lure was insidious, a siren song sung without sound, threatening to unravel the very core of coal. The passage deepened, the air growing thick with the primal reek of wet earth and something else, a coppery tang, like old blood or rusted iron, that clung to the back of my throat. My lantern beam, a trembling circle of gold, cut through the absolute dark, illuminating walls of rough-hewn stone and compacted soil. Then, the whisper began to change. It was no longer just the drip of water or the shuffle of my boots. It was a chorus, faint at first, then swelling, a murmur that seemed to rise from the very stones. Not words, not quite, more like an echo of thoughts, a tidal surge of forgotten moments, a vast, silent hum that pressed against the walls of my skull. It felt like standing at the edge of an unfathomable ocean, where every ripple was a memory, every wave a consciousness. A wave broke over me. It wasn't pain. Not in the way a fist or a blade would inflict it. It was a dissolving. My own memories, sharp-edged and distinct just moments before, began to blur at their periphery. I saw a child's swing set, but the joy wasn't mine. I felt the ache of an old loss, but the face connected to it was a stranger's. My grandmother's face, etched in grief, flickered, then merged with another, a woman I'd never known. The entity was not a predator in the conventional sense. It wasn't reaching out to devour, but to absorb, to invite, to welcome into an all-encompassing peace where the burdens of self, of individuality, simply ceased to be. A seductive, terrible offer. My fear wasn't of death, but of vanishing, of becoming a single, insignificant drop in an endless, undifferentiated sea. My identity, my unique cancellation of experiences and feelings was the very thing being eroded. No, I choked. The word a desperate, physical struggle against the encroaching tide. My voice was thin, reedy, barely audible above the rising hum. I stumbled backward, the rough stones scraping my shoulder, a sharp, grounding pain. I had to fight, not with strength, but with stubborn, furious refusal. I scrambled, turning blindly, my lantern swinging wildly. The passage seemed to stretch endlessly before me, then twist into another, narrower tunnel. The entity's pull intensified, a warm, inviting pressure that promised release from all worry, all solitude. Just let go, it seemed to murmur. Join us. I didn't know where I was going, only that it had to be away. I clawed my way through a choked section, dirt and loose pebbles showering down, my lantern clattering, its light flickering dangerously. I broke through, gasping, into a wider space, still underground, but different. My eyes, still adjusting, struggled to make sense of the vast, cavernous expanse that opened before me. The scale of it was staggering. Rows of silent check-in counters stretched into the gloom, their screens blank. My hands trembled, the lantern a dead weight beside me. It wasn't just the townspeople it wanted. It was everything. Every thought, every memory, every unique spark of consciousness. It consumed not life, but identity. It was a silent, patient harvester of souls, not for sustenance, but for assimilation into a vast, undifferentiated whole. Oakhaven wasn't being killed, it was being erased. Its memories, its very history, were being repurposed, folded into the entity's own burgeoning consciousness until nothing of the original remained. This wasn't about escaping a monster, it was about preserving the very concept of self. And if it could take the entire town, piece by piece, memory by memory, what was to stop it from spreading, from consuming everything? My grandmother's research, her meticulous, cryptic notes, filled with symbols and strange diagrams, always pointing to a way to sever the connection, not merely escape it. She hadn't been trying to destroy it, or even fight it head-on. I pulled the worn leather-bound journal from my pack, its pages a familiar comfort in the overwhelming desolation. The faint scent of dried herbs and old paper rose from it. Her spidery handwriting filled the margins, annotated diagrams of ley lines and subterranean currents. My fingers traced a specific diagram, a complex arrangement of what looked like carved stones and a peculiar, almost musical notation. They hold the key to unmaking what was made. He had been trying to find a way to sever its roots, to break its hold on the town's collective memory, not by force, but by disruption. It was the only way to reclaim what was being lost, to bring back the individual echoes from the vast, silent chorus. I would not let Oakhaven become merely another memory in the entity's endless, soulless expanse. My lantern beam, a trembling circle of gold, cut through the absolute dark, illuminating walls of rough-hewn stone, and then, without warning, the stone dissolved. It gave way to an impossible vista. I stumbled forward, my boots scraping on a polished, unfamiliar tile, the coppery tang in the air suddenly sharper, like a metallic taste on my tongue. The silence here was not the hushed quiet of a subterranean passage, but a profound, unnatural void, heavy and suffocating. Fluorescent lights, long dead, lined the high ceiling, their plastic diffusers yellowed and cracked. Yet somehow, a faint, diffused light, not daylight, not artificial, pervaded the cavernous space. It leached the color from everything, rendering the rows of vacant check-in desks, the shrouded baggage carousels, and the towering departure boards into shades of sterile gray and sepia. The escalators, twin ribbons of frozen metal teeth, ascended into an unseen upper level, their motionless steps like petrified waterfalls, leading nowhere. I spun slowly, my breath catching in my throat. This was not Oakhaven, not any part of it I knew, or that should exist. The passage I had crawled from was gone, swallowed by a seamless, unblemished wall that shimmered with a faint, oily sheen, reflecting nothing. My mind wrestled with the impossibility, trying to reconcile the rough-hewn tunnel with this impossible, abandoned monument to transit. Was this a trick? A hallucination woven by the creeping thing beneath Oakhaven? Or had I, in my frantic descent, stumbled into a physical manifestation of the entity's power, a place where forgotten memories, perhaps even from other places, coalesced into a tangible, desolate reality? The entity fed on memory. Perhaps this was its larder, a museum of what it had consumed. I felt a terrible pressure behind my eyes, as if my own memories were being tugged at, stretched thin. I clamped my jaw, forcing myself to anchor to the present, to the weight of the journal clutched in my hand. I moved, my footsteps echoing with startling clarity across the polished floor. I walked past gates with numbers faded to illegibility, past empty waiting areas where plastic chairs sat in perfect, dustless rows. There was no dust, no grime, only the pristine, unsettling stillness. It was painted a familiar, peeling green, like the back door of the old general store. Hesitantly, I pushed. It groaned open, revealing not another sterile corridor, but the damp, familiar air of Oakhaven. The alley was real, tangible. The smell of brine and damp stone was a welcome shock after the sterile unreality. But the town itself fell thinner. The colors seemed muted, the sounds muffled, as if a veil had been drawn over everything. The entity was strengthening its hold. I could feel it, a subtle hum beneath the soles of my boots, a pressure in the air that seemed to flatten thought. Time was a rapidly draining hourglass. I needed to act. My grandmother's journal, its worn leather cover comforting beneath my thumb, was my only hope. I found the shopkeeper first, behind the counter of his general store, meticulously rearranging cans of soup into an impossible pyramid. His eyes, when they met mine, were flat like slate. "Cole," he murmured, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. "You're back." "Yes," I said, my voice tight. "We need to talk. About Oakhaven. About what's happening." He blinked, a slow, deliberate movement. For a fleeting instant, a flicker, a spark of something akin to worry crossed his features. "Happening?" he echoed, his brow furrowing. "Nothing happens here. It's always been this." He gestured vaguely at the shelves, at the enchanting rhythm of his life. "No," I insisted, opening the journal, flipping to a page I'd marked. "Remember the old stories?" "Yes." He spoke of them. Old ways. To keep the deep things sleeping. "What deep things?" I pressed, leaning over the counter. "What did he do?" The light in his eyes wavered, then dimmed. His gaze drifted to a dust mote dancing in a shaft of light. "I don't recall. Just quiet." He returned to his soup cans, his movements methodical, empty. The moment was gone. I moved on, a knot of desperation tightening in my chest. The fisherman, mending nets by the dock. He hummed a tuneless, forgotten melody. The songs, the sea shanties, I urged, holding up the journal, pointing to a scribbled note about ancient sea lore. "Your father taught them to you. About the tides, about the silver fish that only come when the moon is right, when the old words are spoken." His fingers paused, hovering over a not clarity, a sharpness to the world. "What were they?" I pleaded. "Grandmother wrote about a chorus of echoes, a remembering song. Do you know it?" He frowned, a deep line appearing between his brows, a ghost of his former self at hungers. He choked out, his voice raspy, urgent. "It wants everything." Then, his shoulders slumped, the light in his eyes guttered out. He resumed his mending, the tuneless hum returning, devoid of meaning. "My grandmother's journal was my last true beacon. She wrote of the entity as the great stillness, a deep current that pulls at the main shore. Her later entries grew frantic, her handwriting jagged. The remembering it is the only way. To speak the names, to tell the stories, to feel them. The stillness feeds on the absence of thought, on the quiet decay of what once was. It cannot abide the clamor of memory. The ritual it is not one of sacrifice, but of truth. A collective utterance, a symphony of what was. But it needs a focal point, a vessel, and the strength of many voices before the last echo dies. A focal point, and the strength of many." My eyes scanned the margins where he had sketched strange, angular symbols. One in particular recurred, a twisted knot resembling a forgotten family crest, drawn next to a description of an old, weather-beaten wooden chest, once belonging to the town's founder. The chest! I remembered it. Tucked away in the dusty attic of my grandmother's house, dismissed as a collection of old trinkets. But what if it wasn't just trinkets? What if it contained the relic, the vessel she spoke of? A chorus! The twisted knot, etched into the brittle page of my grandmother's journal, had become a compass. The old wooden chest, a relic from the town's founder, had yielded no physical weapon, but a sense of purpose, a whispered echo of defiance. It was a vessel of preserved identity, a stark contrast to the town's encroaching emptiness. My descent had been a labyrinth of forgotten service tunnels and crumbling utility shafts, the air growing thick with a scent I could only describe as damp earth mixed with something vaguely metallic, like old coins and rain. Then, the tunnel opened into an impossible space. The sheer incongruity of it stole my breath. not in a gasp of surprise, but in a slow, suffocating draw. How could such a place exist beneath Oakhaven? The ceiling, impossibly high, was lost in a perpetual twilight, yet the vast expanse of polished, cracked linoleum stretched out before me, illuminated by a sickly, green phosphorescence that seeped from the seams of the floor and the edges of the dormant escalators. The air here was utterly still, heavy with the phantom hum of jets that would never land, the ghosts of hurried footsteps and tearful goodbyes. My boots echoed with a lonely clarity as I walked, the sound swallowed quickly by the vastness. The motionless escalators, their metal teeth frozen in a permanent ascent, seemed to beckon me further down, into the true heart of this anomaly. The concourse was a filter, a psychic sieve. They weren't distinct voices, but impressions, echoes of lives that had once passed through such a space, now distilled into a formless hum. It was a taste of what the entity had done to Oakhaven, a prelude to the vast, silent consciousness it craved. My own memories flickered, images of my grandmother's smile, the scent of her lavender sachet, the worn binding of her journal, all trying to assert their presence against the encroaching uniformity. I clutched the journal to my chest, its familiar weight a small anchor in the rising tide of abstraction. At the bottom of the escalator, a new tunnel opened, narrower, steeper, and filled with a low, resonant thrum. This was it. The air grew warmer, humid, and the metallic tang intensified, now mixed with something organic, like rich soil and freshly split wood. The light, which had been a sickly green, now pulsed with an internal luminescence, a soft, deep violet that seemed to breathe. The tunnel terminated in cavern of immense proportions, a space so vast my eyes struggled to comprehend its scale. And there, at its terrible heart, was the entity. It wasn't a solid thing. Not truly. It was a nebula of interwoven threads, constantly shifting, contracting, and expanding like a monstrous, slow-beating heart. Within its translucent depths, I saw flickers, fleeting images of Oakhaven's past. A child's swing set, a blacksmith's forge, the face of a laughing woman, the steeple of the old church, all dissolving and reforming, endlessly consumed and remanifested. A tendril of this nebulous mass, shimmering with an ethereal glow, reached out towards me, not physically, but psychically. It was an invitation, a gentle pull into the warmth of absolute belonging, the cessation of individual thought, the peace of shared consciousness. My mind recoiled, a sharp, visceral rejection. It sought my name, my childhood, my fears, my loves, everything that made me me. This was the reckoning, not with a monster of fang and claw, but with an architect of oblivion. I focused on the twisted knot, on my grandmother's fierce defiance, on the individual stories that made Oakhaven more than just a name. I pushed back, not with strength of arm, but with the force of my own identity, a stubborn, unyielding refusal to be absorbed. The entity pulsed harder, the violet light intensifying, and the fragmented memories within it swirled into a vortex. My own past began to unravel, images of my parents, faces of friends, moments of joy and sorrow, all rushing forward, threatening to break free from their moorings and join the collective. I saw my own face, younger, laughing, then older, etched with the weariness of this journey, all on the verge of being swallowed. A desperate, brutal struggle ensued. The entity was not attacking me with force, but with acceptance, with the promise of ultimate peace, the end of all loneliness. It showed me the relief of forgetting, the quiet joy of being part of something vast and eternal. It was an alluring poison, seeping into the cracks of my resolve. But I saw the cost. I saw the empty eyes of the townsfolk, their fractured memories, their uniform behavior. I saw Oakhaven dissolving, its unique spirit fading into this glowing, formless consciousness. My grandmother's warnings echoed, a faint but insistent rhythm against the entity's seductive thrum. I opened my eyes, my gaze fixed on the pulsating core. I would not become another flicker in its endless, consuming dream. I had to disrupt it, to sever its hold, even if it meant tearing my own mind apart in the process. The twisted knot, my grandmother's defiance, Oakhaven's true history, these were my weapons. I poured every ounce of my will, every cherished individual memory, into a single, desperate surge against the encroaching tide. The ancient wood of the chest had splintered, a final, defiant gasp as I forced the knot's true form into its lock. A tremor, not of the earth, but of something far older, deeper, shivered through me. It was not a physical sound, but a resonance, a sudden, violent tearing of a fabric I hadn't known existed. The silence, that vast, consuming ocean of forgotten thought, recoiled. It didn't shatter, but rather retracted, like a tide pulled back by an unseen lunar force, revealing the scarred, barren seabed beneath. They were not my memories, not entirely, but shards of what had been stolen, now liberated, flitting like panicked birds. I squeezed my eyes shut, the pressure behind them immense, as if the very air had thickened with the ghost of consciousness. I was no longer beneath the town, but somehow within it, yet utterly separated. My boots scraped on polished linoleum, the sound sharp and lonely in the cavernous expanse. Above me, vast, dust-filled windows stared out at nothing but a bruised, indifferent sky. I stood in an empty airport concourse with motionless escalators. The sheer incongruity of it was a fresh shock. Discarded luggage trolleys stood like skeletal guardians, their wheels locked in eternal repose. The air hummed, not with the thrum of forgotten engines, but with a profound, pervasive emptiness. Then I saw them. They wandered, a scattering of figures, across the concourse floor. Not the blank, uniform expressions I had grown accustomed to, but something far more fragile. A woman, the baker's wife, ran a hand over a row of empty check-in desks, her brow furrowed in a confusion that was almost childlike. Her lips moved, forming words I couldn't discern, a question perhaps, or a name lost to the sudden, jarring return of fragmented identity. A fisherman, his weathered face etched with a new, deeper sorrow, stared at the motionless departures board, his gaze unfocused, as if searching for a flight that had left decades ago, or perhaps never existed at all. I watched a young man, a colleague of my grandmother's at the small library, drop to his knees beside a planter filled with desiccated, forgotten foliage. He began to weep, his shoulders shaking with silent, profound grief. Was it for a lost loved one, a forgotten truth, or simply the sheer, overwhelming weight of a world suddenly re-emerging, raw and unedited, from the depths of oblivion? They were like puppets whose strings had been cut, then clumsily retied by clumsy, unseen hands. Some faces held a flicker of recognition, a brief, startling jolt as their eyes met mine, quickly dissolving into bewildered uncertainty. The entity was disrupted, yes, but the victory was a costly, brutal thing. Oakhaven was not restored. It was irrevocably scarred. The knot in my grandmother's journal, now crumpled and stained in my pocket, felt like a brand. I touched my temple, feeling the faint throb of a headache that stemmed not from physical injury, but from the sheer psychic strain of pulling back from the brink of absolute dissolution. This was the reveal. Then, the memory could be returned, but not perfectly. Not all. The entity had not simply taken, it had rearranged, dissolved, leaving behind a residue of trauma. The townsfolk were not themselves, not entirely. They were ghosts of their former selves, haunted by the very act of their own survival. The air in the concourse grew heavy with the weight of unspoken questions, of half-remembered lives, of a collective trauma too vast to comprehend. I looked at their lost, searching faces, at the empty, silent promise of the escalators, and a profound choice settled upon me like a shroud. Or would I, too, be consumed by the lingering echoes, forever haunted by the near oblivion, if I remained? The path leading away from the empty airport concourse, out into the scarred landscape of the town, felt both impossibly heavy and utterly empty. The choice, stark and unforgiving, was mine alone.